Roberts, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. My name is Bill Roberts. I am running for U.S. Congress, and I do so for the same reason I'm here today, which is that if I were not here to say what I'm saying today, no one would say it. I'm calling on the Detroit City Council to reject any cuts that endanger the lives of human beings, and instead to publicly call for and fight for the reinstatement of House Resolution 1489, the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, which both congressmen from Detroit are co-sponsors of, to break up the too-big-to-fail banks.
That's right.
The reason why I bring this up today is because it is clear that 75% of major cities enter into interest rate swaps. These interest rate swaps were rigged against cities at the highest level, at the LIBOR, the London interbank offered rate. Now, this is murder. This is not insider trading. This is murder. It has resulted in cuts to departments that have killed people. There were people at the highest level involved in this. I call upon the Detroit City Council to stand up and have the guts to tell the private bankers that they are going to jail.
Thank you.
Mr. President?
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say that the last speaker is absolutely correct. And when AIG failed, Detroit's interest rates went up. Mm-hmm. We got hit by default. And then meanwhile, they still got bailed out. And the owners got bonuses after being bailed out by the federal government. But when they failed, they had agreed to stand behind our debt. And when they went down, our rates went up. So there's an absolute connection to that. And I appreciate him bringing that up. The debt should be renegotiated in Detroit. Thank you.
Thank you.
On July 24th, 2012, then candidate for Congress Bill Roberts delivered the foregoing warning to the City Council of Detroit that either Glass-Steagall be immediately reinstated and the criminals on Wall Street be sent to jail, or else the cuts that would result from attempting to honor the fraudulent and usurious obligations to these banks on Wall Street would cause the death en masse of the people of Detroit and the citizens of the United States generally. 1 year later, with Glass-Steagall still being blocked by Wall Street lackeys on the Financial Services Committee in Congress and elsewhere, this week, the city of Detroit has become the largest municipality in U.S. history to file for bankruptcy, Chapter 9. 4 months after the appointment of an unelected emergency financial manager, Kevin Orr, to restructure the debts and finances of the government of Detroit, a bankruptcy petition was filed on Thursday of last week, which would allow the city to default on billions of dollars of outstanding debt owed to pensioners and other municipal employees, many of whom have no other source of income to support themselves and their families. After failing to blackmail the city workers and retirees into accepting voluntary cuts to their pensions, the emergency financial management has now simply declared that these debts will not be paid. Such an action directly violates the Michigan State Constitution, which explicitly states that the accrued financial benefits of each pension plan and retirement system of the state and its political subdivisions shall be a contractual obligation thereof, which shall not be diminished or impaired thereby. Lawsuits have already been filed to block Kevin Orr's bankruptcy filing in federal court on the grounds that it violates the sanctity of these public pension contracts, with Michigan State Judge Rosemarie Aquilina ruling last Friday that such an action was unconstitutional and ordering Governor Snyder to withdraw the petition for bankruptcy. As a result, Snyder has appealed the ruling to a federal court in an attempt to circumvent the Constitution of the state of Michigan, and has even threatened to hold Judge Aquilina in contempt. Meanwhile, as Kevin Orr maneuvers to pay city pensioners merely pennies on the dollar, he has worked out a separate deal with the city's biggest creditors, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, and others, promising to pay them 75 to 80 cents on the dollar for interest rate swaps and other derivatives deals which Detroit had been lured into purchasing in a desperate attempt to raise revenue over recent years. These debtor-in-possession loan deals take precedence for repayment above all other creditors in bankruptcy proceedings. Such an agreement with the very banks responsible for Detroit's bankruptcy to sacrifice the unsecured creditors among the pensioners and city workers for the sake of fulfilling the city's obligations to the banks is the mirror image of the bail-in policy which the EU financial dictatorship forced down the throats of the people of Cyprus. What we now see in the case of Detroit is by no means an isolated case of bad financial management or necessary but temporary pain, as the Obama administration would claim, but is rather merely the precursor of what is already planned for the United States as a whole, were Glass-Steagall to be defeated. Truly a test case for genocide.
I think what you've got with Detroit is not an honest policy of trying to fix the finances of the city of Detroit, but you've got a policy of genocide. And it's very clear cut, and that's why Detroit right now is a certain type of test case for what's going to happen to the American population. What they're doing in filing for bankruptcy is really just a continuation or an acceleration of the rate of death that's been created by having a policy which has been upheld under the Obama administration, basically having a bonanza for the G-SIFI, too big to jail banks at the expense of the population, who is sacrificed by forcing a commitment to saving their gambling debts by the city of Detroit in this case. And a year ago, I warned the Detroit City Council that they have got to reject any policy that causes the loss of life of citizens. Of course, and that's what's been happening with the shutdown of police and fire stations. The city of Detroit now has a crime rate, on an order of magnitude higher than cities like New York, because so many police and fire stations have been shut down that the officers are operating on a rotation basis. You got 3 out of the 10 most violent neighborhoods in the country are in the city of Detroit. So you've just seen a collapse process take place. And this has come about because what happened was that the city of Detroit was sucked into a criminal scheme, a set of financial derivatives, essentially, that were set by the LIBOR or set by banks that had been involved in the criminal activity of rigging this LIBOR rate. And so they were bilked. They were bilked out of hundreds of millions of dollars. And when AIG, as the one city councilor pointed out to me a year ago, when AIG went under, they got bailed out. But the city of Detroit's rates, because of this default, went through the roof. And so it's just a very open and shut case where the policy of the Obama administration to have no criminal action taken against the criminals who have committed these crimes against the American people, that under that Obama and Timothy Geithner administration policy, this is what has happened to Detroit. And so what happens now is going to be what happens to the American population. If Glass-Steagall is defeated, then you will have a sacrifice of the American population under a policy of fascism. And in the case of Detroit, one of the things that's going on with this Chapter 11 bankruptcy is they're attempting to actually circumvent the Michigan Constitution, which actually says that pension obligations of the workers of the municipalities and the government of Michigan are sacred, that those obligations are sacred. And so you have a policy of going around the Constitution, and it's really going around the U.S. Constitution as well, which is the larger point. And this will happen, and it will be the standard for what happens to the rest of the American population if Glass-Steagall is defeated. So we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. That cannot happen. This Glass-Steagall has to be put through immediately, or this is what the rest of the country is going to look like.
Now, if we don't get Glass-Steagall through, you can forget the United States and Europe for an indefinite period to come, even possibly forever. Because if this, what the intention is, and this is what you have to really understand, the intention is to, first of all, defeat Glass-Steagall. That's the first objective. Once Glass-Steagall is rejected, or were rejected, then the next measure would be what is not advertised. There's no way in which the trans-European area can possibly effect a real bailout of themselves. They're hopelessly bankrupt. Their answer is, once Glass-Steagall were eliminated, then they would just simply shut off all payments to their debtors, which would mean you would throw a major part of the population of Europe and the United States in particular to sit on the streets and starve to death. And that is exactly what the intention is. If you look at this thing carefully, you don't have to have information on the inside to see what is threatened. All you have to do is look at the figures. Let the amount of debt, the rate of increase of that debt, of the Wall Street kind of debt, there's no possible way that they can avoid, as a Wall Street gang, they can avoid discrediting all of their debts to people generally. That means that the people will be shut off from all sustenance, which means mass death coming on fast inside the United States and also Western and Central Europe in large degree. There is no possible way. You have to realize that the debt, the Wall Street debt, and similar kind of debt, could never be covered by obligations. Never. Is past that and going further. So therefore, the option is they stall everything as long as they can, prevent Glass-Steagall from being introduced. And if they do that, then they cancel the debts. Now that Glass-Steagall has no claim on them, they will simply cancel the debts of Wall Street and similar forces around the world. And what will happen to the people? The obligations to the people simply don't exist because the debt is repudiated. And that's the situation we're in now. That is the reason, not why because people understand what's happening, but because they have a feeling of what is happening. They have a sense of what is happening. And they see no possibility of anybody doing anything to help them. And therefore they're trying to deny the threat, which is what people do. They try to say, no, everything's going to be all right, isn't it? Everything is going to be all right, isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? Huh? And then, if Glass-Steagall comes through, rejoicing. And Wall Street is bankrupted. So, who does that hurt? Nobody of importance.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
President Roosevelt makes an unprecedented 9,000-mile tour of the United States to see for himself the nation at war. Visiting armament plants from coast to coast, he stops at the giant Chrysler tank arsenal, where he sees the Army's latest mechanized monsters tested as they come from assembly lines. Then, on to one of Henry Ford's great bomber plants, where the President and First Lady are greeted by Mr. Ford and General Manager Sorensen. Plane workers, delighted with the surprise visit, show the President that wartime production is meeting the goal set, many plants exceeding their quotas.
We shall send you in ever-increasing numbers, ships, planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose and our pledge.
And the President's words meant action. America became the arsenal of democracy.
Working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where General Motors has undertaken to produce more than 10% of all war material fabricated from metal. Thousands of workmen in 4 GM divisions turn off machine guns on a mass production basis. Output is months ahead of schedule. General Motors has pioneered in applying mass production methods to the manufacture of aircraft. Work goes on day and night under the deft fingers of General Motors men and women. They are producing an avalanche of weapons for victory in General Motors manufacturing centers all over America. Machine tools, the master tools of industry and of victory, are made at a constantly increasing rate.
So there was a joke in the 1930s. How many states are there in the Union? And the answer was 48, because Kentucky and Tennessee moved to Detroit during the wartime mobilization. That's what actually built up Detroit. It was the auto sector to a certain degree, but then under the Roosevelt policy of the wartime arsenal of democracy mobilization, Detroit became the hub of the productive process. And the credit arrangements were made available, and the CEOs were brought together to plan out how the auto factories of Detroit would become the productive engine for everything that was needed to defeat fascism and defeat the Nazis in World War II. Now, Lyndon LaRouche in 2006 put forward a proposal which was endorsed and supported by many city councils in the state of Michigan, including Detroit, Flint. Many labor leaders from the UAW and other unions really backed this proposal. And what the idea was to take a page from Franklin Roosevelt, to retool and bring back in the unused labor, the individuals who had worked in the auto factories, and employ them in a process of building domestic infrastructure to fill the deficit of infrastructure for the nation, and that we would be able to take the machine tool capacity throughout this area of Michigan, Ohio, this machine tool sector, and retool it to get the engine of the economy moving again. Now, that was rejected by the Bush administration and by the Congress at that time under direction of this fascist Wall Street grouping, Felix Rohatyn, etc. And the result for the city of Detroit was that the big three went into bankruptcy and was so-called bailed out, sort of starting under the Bush administration and going into the Obama administration. But if you look at what was actually bailed out in this process, it was the credit operation of the big three automakers, and it was the finance end. But the productive capability, both within the city of Detroit and around it, was largely shut down. It was largely scrapped in the name of shareholder value. Many auto workers took the buyout, seeing which way things were going, and figured that was the only way to secure their pensions. So a lot of the labor force being paid the higher income rates, the type of rates that provide the sort of revenue base that the city of Detroit and the surrounding area had come to depend on, that level of wages was replaced with half the wage of the new workers that were brought in. So you had a process in which, again, the revenue base was stripped out leaving the city of Detroit in a financial mess, much of the area in a financial mess. And so it was the rejection of the LaRouche PAC policy, and then the further acceleration of the attack on this machine tool capacity and the Franklin Roosevelt legacy in this area, really, which has got us to the situation where we are today.
Detroit has been in a depression for decades now. The country may have been in a recession, but Detroit has been in depression. The banks have plundered and pillaged. They're making millions of dollars off the misery of the city of Detroit, and they are being paid while they threaten the pensioners. We have about a 50% unemployment rate in the city of Detroit, in real terms. 50%. That means every other Detroiter you see is unemployed and seeking and wishing to have work, even if they stop looking. We've closed, literally, over the last few years, 200 schools. 200 schools, decimating neighborhoods. It is also, with the services for the city, the EMS trucks often are overextended and people wait hours to be serviced from an emergency. And it's almost always better to rush to the hospital yourself than to wait for an EMS truck. Fires go on and spread from unoccupied homes, catching fire on occupied homes, and further destroying neighborhoods because of archaic and non-functioning equipment and the lack of trucks and firemen able to put out the fires. The police response time is literally in the hours instead of the minutes. The street lights are out in almost 50% of the city. Crime flourishes, desperation expounds, and the misery index probably eclipses most places in the United States and in some cases on the planet Earth. We're the capital in the world of abandoned homes and properties. There are more abandoned buildings in the city of Detroit than anywhere else in the world. Well, you know, if Mr. LaRouche chose, he could say, "I told you so." He predicted the current economic collapse. And if we don't heed those words, we are facing some extremely dire times. I don't know if the ship can be turned around, but they certainly can't if we don't reinstate the Glass-Steagall, if we don't put in a works program similar to what Mr. LaRouche has called for and to what Franklin Delano Roosevelt instituted. We must build infrastructure. It is now archaic. Much of it is still part of the 19th and 20th century, and we must move on for the 21st and prepare for the 22nd century. We must expand and develop the infrastructure and create jobs, and thereby increasing the standard of living for all Americans.
Detroit, once the great industrial engine of the nation, has experienced a decades-long population collapse of truly genocidal proportions. A city originally built on mass production, with the highest concentration of skilled productive labor in the nation, has been the victim of an increasingly accelerating breakdown crisis over the past more than 60 years, almost 3 generations. The population of Detroit began to explode around the turn of the 20th century, increasing exponentially around 1910. However, with the crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression, the population of Detroit began to level off and even decline for the first time in its history. It wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy that the population began to grow again, surging to its maximum in 1950 with a population of over 1.8 million people, making Detroit the 5th largest city in the United States at the time. However, after 1950, the population began to drop once again, slowly at first, but accelerating over time. By the year 2000, the population had collapsed to under 1 million, and by 2010 to 713,000, less than the population was a century before, a more than 60% drop from its peak in 1950, a loss of over 1 million people. This genocide will only continue to accelerate at an ever-increasing rate under the bankers' dictatorship now controlling the city.
The fascist state is here in Detroit in that we don't have democracy. We vote for a mayor who has no power. We vote for a council who has no power. And yes, we vote for a school board who has no power. And we've been in waiting, and this was supposed to be an emergency. But what we find is that once the dictators come in, they don't leave. We've had, for the last 4.5 consecutive years, we've had an emergency manager or / emergency financial manager for the Detroit Public Schools. We're concerned about the loss of democratic rights here in the city of Detroit. This is what we're speaking about Kevin Orr right now in the city of Detroit. He became initially a emergency financial manager, which limited him to just being over the finances of the city. And they then grandfathered the city of Detroit in for an emergency manager, which has complete control under Public Act 436, complete control over the assets and the lives of the citizens of the city of Detroit. He is, in effect, a dictator. We, in the city of Detroit, we have a fascist state.
And so this is not an honest policy of fixing the finances of the city of Detroit, as many newspapers are portraying it, in order to turn the situation around. This is an intentional policy of an assault, a genocidal assault on the population, and this intention to actually save the creditors. What the intention here is, by the emergency financial manager, is to pay Bank of America and these other G-SIFI banks 70, 80 cents on the dollar, and then basically turn around and rip up the contracts to the city, retired city workers. And these are workers who did not pay under, a city pension plan. City workers in cities don't have to pay into Social Security. So these are not people who paid into Social Security. These pensions that these people have is income that they already earned. And so this is just, these people's lives are being condemned to death. That's what's actually happening. And I think this point has to be made much more clear. Forget the discussion of money and creditors. What's happening here is an attack. This is a depopulation policy, as one of the authors of the Limits to Growth report recently bragged that under the European Union has been the optimal situation for genocide. That's what's being brought into the United States now. And so Detroit is absolutely a test case. If they can get away with this in Detroit, they can get away with it elsewhere. But on the flip side, if this is made clear, if it's brought to light that this is what's going on, and this is an area in which the British Empire and Obama are very weak because this has been their doing, and it exposes everything that they have intended to do all along. And for that reason, it's extremely important to be defeated.
We're talking about genocide. Genocide against people of a city, a large city. That's what's happening. So the point is, do we, as the United States in particular, because our republic and its constitution are unique in this planet, there is no constitutional structure to match our government, our constitution, in terms of dealing with these kinds of problems. What we have to do is recognize that this is our enemy. What's happening in Detroit, for example, is the action of our enemy, the enemy of the people of the United States. And the people of the United States have to take their own authority back under our constitutional privileges. And this kind of swindle, just these guys are going to be thrown out. Our job in putting Glass-Steagall through is that Glass-Steagall now becomes the pretext for the action. In other words, if Glass-Steagall is upheld, it becomes automatically, by the law, by the vote itself, the agency which reverses this horror. Just enforce Glass-Steagall, and that will give us the means to solve the problem. But it means that the people of the United States have to mobilize to make sure that the law is enforced, and start enforcing it now. And the intention should be now to do just exactly that. It's the only chance to save the life of your neighbors and your family.